Welcome to the online learning series, Traumatic Stress Screening for Child Welfare Professionals, a guide to the University of Minnesota's Traumatic Stress Screen for Children and Adolescents, the TSSCA. This module is part 1 in a 3-part series that has been developed as a collaboration between the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, the AMBIT Network, and the Institute for Translational Research in Children's Mental Health at the University of Minnesota. These organizations have partnered to plan for and develop training materials for child welfare professionals related to children's mental health. Development of this online learning series and the accompanying research briefs further the mission of these organizations by connecting you, child welfare practitioners, to relevant research emerging from the University of Minnesota. Module 1 provides you with a general overview of the tool and the background, development, and evidence supporting the TSSCA. Module 2 will break down administration of the TSSCA step by step with video demonstrations. Module 2 will also introduce you to several practitioners who have used the screen in their practice. Module 3 will provide next steps for after you've completed the screen with a client. Module 1 will provide an overview of the context and development of the TSSCA, including the rationale behind its creation, the process of development, the evidence base supporting its use, its limitations, and its specific applications to child welfare. We will also discuss the differences between screening and assessment. We hope to provide child welfare professionals with the knowledge needed to understand the context and evidence supporting the development of the TSSCA. This module contains 6 sections. While the module has been developed to be watched in order, you can navigate between sections to review. Section 1, Background. The TSSCA was developed at the University of Minnesota by Katelyn Donisch, Dr. Bray, and Dr. Abigail Gewirtz in collaboration with the AMBIT Network and the Institute for Translational Research in Children's Mental Health, ITR. The AMBIT Network's purpose is to increase access to high-quality evidence-based care for traumatized children, families, and community. ITR aims to advance quality research, evidence-based clinical training, and information dissemination focused on children's mental health and development, ages 0 to 18. The shared mission of each of these organizations is to bring relevant research in children's mental health into the hands of practitioners. In light of this shared mission, a collaborative effort has emerged to develop trauma-informed practices in child welfare in Minnesota. The TSSCA is a quick, simple, and reliable instrument to screen children for traumatic stress symptomology. For more information about post-traumatic stress symptomology, and post-traumatic stress disorder in children, please refer to the reference provided at the end of this presentation. The TSSCA was designed to provide clinicians, caseworkers, educators, juvenile probation officers, and other staff with a tool for screening children ages 5 to 18 years that have or may have experienced a traumatic event and are in need of services. The instrument uses 5 questions to measure children's traumatic stress, as well as extensive instructions and recommendations for using the instrument. The screen is not intended to assess for post-traumatic stress disorder or to make a clinical diagnosis. Results from the screen are meant to assist individuals in considering referral for a trauma assessment and additional services. One of the first steps that we can take towards increasing access for traumatized children to high-quality, evidence-based care is identifying the kids who might need it. Several studies have shown that many children involved in the child welfare system have experienced traumatic stress. These children are at increased risk for PTSD and symptomology. By identifying children who are experiencing traumatic stress symptoms in the child welfare system, we can more efficiently link them to appropriate services. One way to identify these children is through screening. In addition, a qualitative study conducted at the University of Minnesota to examine conceptualizations of trauma-informed practice among child welfare professionals found that child welfare professionals are interested in trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed systems. One area of need identified by workers was screening. The folks on the ground see the need and want a brief screen to improve their practice. Based on this need, the TSSCA was developed to help improve access to quality care for youth in the child welfare system in 3 ways. The TSSCA was developed to aid agencies in identification. One of the developers of the TSSCA, Katelyn Donisch, explained this by saying that trauma screening can help identify and provide treatment to youth before symptoms become more severe. Without trauma-informed screening, youth's trauma exposure and related symptomology often go undetected, leading mental health and other providers across service systems to diagnose symptoms and disorders that may only partially explain a youth's presentation. Proper screening will help to identify youth who are at risk for developing more severe and pervasive symptoms if not identified and treated early. The TSSCA was also developed to aid in the referral process. Youth with positive screens can be referred for more comprehensive trauma-informed assessment. Referral through screening streamlines the route to service provision. In addition, brief screens reduce the amount of time spent administering longer assessments to children who may not need them. Finally, the TSSCA was developed to help child welfare organizations adopt an overall trauma-informed approach. Section 2. Trauma-Informed Systems. The AMBIT network is a site for the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, or NCTSN. NCTSN was established by Congress in 2000 to, in the words of their mission, raise the standard of care and improve access to services for traumatized children, their families, and communities throughout the United States. According to NCTSN, creating trauma-informed service is essential to NCTSN's mission of raising the standard of care and improving access to services for children, families, and communities impacted by trauma. A trauma-informed child and family service system is one in which all parties involved respond to and recognize the impact of traumatic stress on those who have contact with the system, including children, caregivers, and service providers. Programs and agencies within such a system infuse and sustain trauma awareness, knowledge, and skills into their organizational cultures, practices, and policies. They act in collaboration with all those who are involved with the child, using the best available science to facilitate and support the recovery and resiliency of the child and family. According to NCTSN, quote, a service system with a trauma-informed perspective is one in which programs, agencies, and service providers 1. Routinely screen for trauma exposure and related symptoms. 2. Use culturally appropriate evidence-based assessment and treatment for traumatic stress and associated mental health symptoms. 3. Make resources available to children, families, and providers on trauma exposure, its impact, and treatment. 4. Engage in efforts to strengthen the resilience and protective factors of children and families impacted by and vulnerable to trauma. 5. Address parent and caregiver trauma and its impact on the family system. 6. Emphasize continuity of care and collaboration across child service systems. And 7. Maintain an environment of care for staff that addresses, minimizes, and treats secondary traumatic stress and that increases staff resilience. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the United States, also views trauma as a major public health concern. SAMHSA has recognized that public institutions and service systems play an important role in either perpetuating or reducing the effects of trauma on individuals working and being served within those systems. With this in mind, SAMHSA recommends a trauma-informed approach to service administration in systems serving large numbers of trauma survivors. These systems include behavioral health, justice, and child welfare. According to SAMHSA's concept of trauma-informed approach, a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system, responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. All of this is to say that the creation of the TSSCA helps to fill the gap in just one domain of both NCTSN's and SAMHSA's suggested implementation schemas. Please consider use of the TSSCA within the construct of your organization's overall approach to trauma. For more information on SAMHSA's trauma-informed approach, please refer to the resources provided at the end of this presentation. Section 3. Screening versus assessment. At this point, you may be thinking of familiar assessments for trauma that you've used in your practice or come across in training. In order to talk about the development of the TSSCA, we need to carefully distinguish between screening and assessment. In their overview of trauma-informed screening and assessment in child welfare settings, NCTSN distinguishes between the two, writing that trauma-informed screening refers to a brief, focused inquiry to determine whether an individual has experienced specific traumatic events or reactions to trauma. Trauma assessment is a more in-depth exploration of the nature and severity of traumatic events, the impact of those events, current trauma-related symptoms, and functional impairment. In other words, screening is intended to simply identify the possible existence of a problem. It is identifying or flagging individuals for further consideration. The outcome of a screen is usually a simple yes or no. Yes, meaning that there might be a problem and the child should be considered for a more in-depth assessment and treatment. No means that the presence of the problem was not detected. It is important to know that a screen does not have to be your only criteria for referral for assessment. Other factors, such as case history, can also serve as a rationale to refer to the child for a more in-depth, intensive assessment. A screen should be brief. This allows for the screen to be used with a large number of individuals with relative ease. By the same rationale, screen administration typically requires less training than a formal assessment, allowing for the final point of universal administration. Screens are intended to identify select groups of individuals, including those who may otherwise be undetected from a larger group. However, in some cases, using the screen with targeted groups is also reasonable. For example, you may want to screen children for whom services are available if required. An assessment, on the other hand, can be used to diagnose or give detailed information about the problem. An assessment can also be used to plan treatment. Assessments are used selectively based on individual need as determined by case history or through a screening process. Assessments also tend to be longer and more resource-intensive, requiring a highly trained administrator. Many evidence-based trauma assessments exist. However, relatively fewer screens exist for childhood traumatic stress symptomology. The TSSCA was developed to help fill this gap. However, the administration of the screen may reveal a lack of available resources to treat traumatized children in your area. It is important to note that identifying these children may be a first step in identifying need and provide an important rationale for planning eventual provision of service and trauma-informed practices within your organization. Section 4. Development. The TSSCA was developed using an item response modeling approach using the University of California's Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Reaction Index. The UCLA PTSD-RI is the gold standard assessment measure for PTSD in children and adolescents. The research team developing the TSSCA used item response modeling to create a 15-item questionnaire with questions representing symptoms of traumatic stress. Items were selected to map directly onto DSM-4 and DSM-5 intrusion, avoidance, and arousal criteria. The questionnaire was then administered to a sample of individuals described in the next slides to test for sensitivity and specificity. Section 5. Empirical Support. The overall sample consisted of 108 youth seen in community and mental health settings. Here, the sample is broken down by sex, age, ethnicity, and race. Tables 3 and 4 break down the samples by place of residence and trauma history characteristics. The research team ran a number of regression models to find the items that explain the most variance in the model. These 5 questions were best able to predict that a clinically significant score on the UCLA PTSD-RI-4 diagnostic tool. In other words, these 5 questions identified traumatic stress symptomology nearly as well as the full UCLA diagnostic tool, but has the benefit of being much more brief. The TSSCA has been demonstrated to have strong overall sensitivity and good specificity. Sensitivity means that the percentage of children and adolescents with elevated levels of traumatic stress symptomology who are correctly identified as such. In other words, sensitivity conveys how well the tool identifies kids with symptoms. Specificity is the percentage of children without elevated traumatic stress symptomology who are identified as such. Specificity tells you how well the tool weeds out kids who don't have symptoms. A cutoff score of 4 yields 89% sensitivity and 79% specificity. A cutoff score of 5 or higher yields 84% sensitivity and 70% specificity. However, there are some concerns. First, this sample was small, meaning that the analysis had relatively low power. Second, the sample overrepresented Caucasians, females, and youth with high rates of trauma exposure. These concerns have started to be addressed by collecting data from a larger, more diverse sample of youth. However, analysis of that data has not yet begun. Thank you for participating in the Traumatic Stress Screening for Child Welfare Professionals, Module 1, Background and Development. The final section of this presentation provides you with resources for further reading, acknowledgments, and references. For additional information on the subjects covered in this series, please refer to the following resources. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to Chris Bray or Sophia Frank. Special thanks to the following individuals for their contributions to this learning series. The following resources were used to develop this learning series. Congratulations, you have completed the Traumatic Stress Screening for Child Welfare Professionals Module 1, Background and Development.